Wow, guys, I just stepped outside and my frame rate just plummeted. So, as people rightly pointed out in my GTX 1060 video, I should have waited till I was out in the open world, but I just did not know that the performance was going to just absolutely tank when you went outside. So now I know. Maybe I'll reshoot the 1060 video if I have time. We'll see. Anyway, what are we testing out in this video? RX 6800 XT. Right now we're at 4K native resolution, and I am at the ultra quality preset. So this is absolutely maxed out settings at 4K. And at the beginning of the game, I was just so happy with my performance. I was getting in the mid 70s to mid 80s, sometimes even up into the 90 FPS range when I was inside. But you know what? You open up the outside, and apparently 60 FPS is a bit of a struggle. You can see it here dropping down into like the mid 50s. There's a bunch of enemies here. I'm gonna fight a few of them, and then we'll try out some other graphics settings. I don't want to kill them all because I want them as part of my benchmark, so, you know. Anyway, so you can see that we kind of bounce around into the 60s, but also down into the 50s. So, I mean, maybe it's a 60 FPS average, but we're certainly not keeping 60 FPS minimums. That guy stuck me. I'm glad this is on normal mode so I didn't die, because I'm not paying a lot of attention to the combat. Okay, so this is your benchmark at absolute maxed out settings. As you can see, we bounce around, but we will go below 60 FPS. Now, not everybody plays at 4K, so before we try lowering settings, let's say, well, what if you're wanting to know how it does at 1440p? Well, I don't really want to restart and edit the video and all of that, so I'm just going to render scale from 1440p. Now, I have tested this before where I actually start the game in 1440p, and the performance is very similar. This might be slightly, maybe not quite as perfect as native, but I honestly couldn't really notice a difference. I was testing that out on the multiplayer, but I really didn't notice a difference, render scaling versus just like actually setting my monitor to that resolution. You can see that at 1440p, we're up here in the mid 80s. If I get down into this area, it's a little more demanding. But you can see that, you know, at 1440p, I think playing at native resolution, it seems like you'll at least stay into the mid-70s and often be up into the 80s or 90s if it's not quite as intense of a scene. But you guys might also be curious about 1080p. You're like, who has an RX 6800 XT and also has 1080p monitor? A lot of people who mostly play esports, right? But you might also play the campaign, you know? It's free on Xbox Game Pass. By the way, you guys know you can get like a $1 Game Pass thing, right? I mean, if you haven't done it recently. So there's no reason you can't play this game for $1. Anyway, so 1080p ultra settings, and we're over 100 FPS now. Although down in this area, we will still drop into the 80s a bit, although it's mostly in the 90s and 100s. So we're doing our little run through the grass benchmark here. Try not to die, dodge the bullets. So performance is like definitely, you know, good enough at 1080p. Although I will say, I would kind of hope that on a GPU this powerful, you'd be up over like 120. So the performance in this game is pretty demanding once you hit this open world area. Anyway, let's go back to 4K and let's look at, okay, ultra settings are oftentimes kind of stupid. And I watched the Digital Foundry optimized graphics settings video, and they definitely recommend high settings on almost everything. Now, I'm gonna leave the textures at ultra. Now, one reason is I'd have to restart the game for it to go down anyway, but also because of my VRAM. This GPU has 16 gigabytes of VRAM. I can leave the textures at ultra. And then the other thing that stays at ultra is effects quality, which again, according to that Digital Foundry video, they didn't see much difference between lowering it in performance or visuals until you go all the way down to low. So I'm gonna leave those at ultra because then I don't need to restart and edit the video together and all of that. Saves me a huge amount of time and effort. So let's go ahead and do that. So high settings, let's see if we can actually maintain over 60 FPS. I'm hoping we can, but we'll see. Let's also hope these guys don't kill me, but I guess it's not the end of the world if I restart. I'd kill them, but they're part of my benchmark. It seems like we're mostly, like I saw it go down to 59 for a split second. So it does look like it will maybe dip to 59, but you are for the most part 60 FPS and up, it looks like, in this pretty demanding area of the game at 4K native at the high settings. I'd honestly actually recommend some render scaling, but along those lines, let's test this out at 1440p. So let's do 1440p at high settings and see how we do. Again, the high settings to me, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between high and ultra. You'd have to do some really serious side-by-side peeping at the details and all that. Looks like at 1440p, we're in the 80s and 90s. You know, honestly though, performance here seems fine. So I think 1440p high settings is also pretty good. Again, I would hope for a little better, but you know, you're not going to feel like the game's super choppy in the mid-80s FPS range into the 90s. So I think that's reasonable. Let's also test it out at 1080p. So let's go down to 1080p, again, high settings with those couple things on ultra. Get my shields back so I don't die. Then we'll jump down here. I'm hoping we'll be closer to that 100 FPS and up mark. It looks like we are for the most part. Staring out this way, is the more demanding kind of look out into the distance, and we're still pretty close to 100. We're up in the upper 90s. So it's looking, yeah, at 1080p high settings, you're going to be pretty much 100 plus with a few occasional dips below that. All right, now let's go back to 4K, and I am actually going to res scale a bit. So I've actually played around with this a bit off camera, and this is actually how I'm going to play the game. I'm going to play the game at 1800p, 84% res scale at high settings. And on my 4K screen, even though it's a giant 48-inch OLED monitor, the 84% res scale here, I really can't even tell it's happening, to be honest. The render scaler in this game is extremely good. Very good. It's, I think, better than FSR. I think it's some form of TAA upscaling, it looks like, to my eye. And it does a great job. I would say it's right up there with DLSS. DLSS has a bit of an AI assistance to their TAA upscaling, so it might be a little bit better if the game had DLSS, but hey, I couldn't use it on my AMD card anyway. So I'm glad that it has its own built-in version that doesn't require a specific GPU. Performance there felt pretty good to me. We stayed up over the 70s, and for me in a single player game, that felt good. So if you want to know what are my recommend settings if you're on a 4K monitor, I think just use the high preset with ultra textures. The effects might as well leave it ultra, maybe go down to high if you really wanted to, and res scale at around 84%. I think that's the way to go. Now, let's go ahead and test out some other graphics settings while we're making the video. We might as well try out medium settings just to compare. So now we're going to be at medium settings. Again, remember the texture quality is actually still at ultra. The effects quality is actually still at ultra because that would require a restart. So going down to medium settings at 4K, it looks like we are once again pretty much in the 70s. So to me, it's not gaining me enough performance compared to the high settings to be worth not playing at the high settings, because you know it doesn't look that much worse, but I can start to tell the difference a little bit on certain things, the lighting, the draw distance, that kind of stuff. So anyway, that was the medium settings, and then let's go ahead and test them out at 1440p. So 1440p, it looks like we can pretty much be over 100 FPS. All right, staring out into the distance, that's usually a bit tougher, and we stayed over 100 FPS at 1440p on medium settings. Let's go ahead and test out 1080p at the medium settings. And it looks like now we're going to be close to that 120 kind of a situation, and often above it. Looks reasonable. Okay. All right, we might as well test out low settings since we're here, even though I wouldn't really recommend using them on this GPU for any reason. But let's go ahead and do low settings. So 1080p low settings, if for some reason that's what you want to do in a single player game on this kind of a GPU. If you just have to be at 150 FPS, well, we'll drop below it a little bit, but that does seem to be about where we're at. And again, I'm intentionally using this open world environment as a stress test. The beginning of the game, the performance was so much better. All right, let's go ahead and go to 1440p at low settings. Now again, I'd recommend, even if you're at 1440p, render scale a little bit below 1440p. I really recommend the render scaling in this game as the best way to actually increase your FPS. But anyway, there's that, and let's go ahead and do it at 4K. So 4K, low settings. And it looks like we can maintain in the 80s at 4K if we're willing to go down to low settings. All right, guys, the last thing I'll say is that you can also, if you don't want to set a manual render scale, you could, I'm going to go back to Ultra here, you could also set a minimum frame rate target. So I could just say I'm happy with like 60 FPS, or you could set a custom, maybe I want the game to be at 80 FPS, and I want it to be, I guess I have to click out of it or something. Oops, I didn't want VSync. Don't VSync. And I don't want a maximum frame rate. No, I do want a maximum frame rate, but we don't want it to be 80. We're going to make it 80. So I want 80 FPS. I set my, oops, I don't want a maximum frame rate. I wanted a minimum frame rate. Guys, I'm sorry, I'm failing you here, but we're not going to edit the video, because then I have to open my editing program, and who knows when I'll get you the video. Okay. So yeah, you know what? We'll set it to an 80 FPS lock. Check that out. The point is, what it's going to do now is dynamic resolution scale. If you set a minimum frame rate target, it sets a dynamic resolution scale, so it will render down to whatever resolution is required to reach the frame rate target. That's the point. And I just want to show you guys that that's a thing. Personally, I'd rather set a manual resolution scale just because I like it to all be consistent. But that's just my personal preference. All right, I think this video is long enough. Hopefully this helped you out. I might retest my 1060 out in this open world setting, and I'll probably also get you guys an RX 6600 video coming in the next day or so. Have an excellent day.